A 92-year-old woman amazed everyone when she gave her old cabin in the woods to a homeless man. But the real surprise awaited him when he went inside. What he found there changed his life forever and revealed a secret she had kept for decades. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The town where Elizabeth Harper lived had never been a place that welcomed noise or grand events. It was a provincial corner of the state, a cluster of houses that had grown slowly over decades, wrapped in the familiar rhythm of church bells on Sundays, the hum of the post office fan in summer, and the faint smell of smoke from chimneys in winter. By the time Elizabeth turned 92, she had watched the entire town transform around her. Neighbors she once exchanged recipes with were gone. Shops had closed or been rebuilt, and even the children she had taught in school were now old enough to have grandchildren of their own. She, however, remained, tucked into a small weather-beaten house on a quiet street, her days marked by the creak of her rocking chair and the occasional letter from a distant acquaintance who still remembered her kindness. Elizabeth was a woman of remarkable endurance. Her skin, pale and fragile as paper, carried the creases of nearly a century of laughter and grief, of worry and relief. Her hands, once firm and quick as they traced words across blackboards or kneaded dough on the kitchen counter, now trembled slightly when she reached for her cane. Yet her mind was sharp. Her eyes still carried a depth that unsettled those who mistook her for weak. Behind the veil of her age, there was still the teacher, the wife, the woman who had lived fully and felt deeply, even if those days seemed to her like a distant echo. What bound her to the past more than anything else was not the old photo albums on her shelf, nor the fading letters from friends long gone. It was the cabin. A small wooden structure hidden deep in the forest outside town, built by her husband James when they were still young. He had been a carpenter, a man with strong arms and a gentle voice, who believed that nothing was more honest than wood freshly cut and fitted together. With his own hands he raised the walls, shaped the beams, carved the porch railings, and set down the roof that would shelter them in summers of warmth and winters of frost. To Elizabeth, that cabin was not merely timber and nails. It was the place where life felt full, where they laughed beside a crackling fire, welcomed friends who brought bread and laughter, and where she and James dreamed aloud about growing old together. When James died, the cabin became a wound she could not touch. He had left suddenly, a stroke that came on a cold evening in November, leaving her with silence so heavy she thought the house itself would collapse under it. In the days that followed, she went to the cabin once, stepping onto the porch with its sagging steps, and when she opened the door, the air inside felt frozen in time. His coat still hung by the entrance, his tools rested in the corner, and their photographs smiled from the mantel as though nothing had changed. But it had, and the sight of those remnants was unbearable. She fled that day, locking the door behind her, and never returned. From then on, the cabin was left to the mercy of seasons and neglect. The forest claimed it, covering its path with roots and moss, its roof with creeping ivy, until it became more a shadow of memory than a real place. Decades passed. Elizabeth aged, her steps slowed, and her circle of life shrank to a handful of streets, a handful of faces. She still woke with discipline, rising with the sun as she always had, making herself tea and butter and toast, even if she rarely ate more than a bite. She sat by her window to watch the world go by, children running to school, dogs tugging their owners down the road, cars flashing with the urgency she no longer understood. Her world had grown small but steady until night fell and she faced the silence again. It was then that the memories came, relentless, the sound of James's laughter echoing from somewhere she could not reach. She often wondered what her life meant now, what weight her years carried. She had no children to inherit her keepsakes, no grandchildren to beg her for stories. The few distant relatives who remained lived hundreds of miles away, their lives too busy to connect with hers. She was, in all ways that mattered, alone. Yet there was a strange clarity in that. At 92, she was no longer afraid of loneliness, though it pressed on her like a heavy coat. She accepted it as she accepted the gray sky, the brittle air, the aches in her bones. Her fear was not loneliness, but waste, that her life would vanish without leaving behind something more meaningful than the small collection of photographs and trinkets scattered through her home. Sometimes she would dream of the cabin. In her sleep, it appeared not as a ruin, but as it once was. Sturdy, warm, lit by lamplight, with James sitting in the rocking chair, his eyes fixed on her with that gentle steadiness she had always leaned on. She would wake with tears drying on her cheeks, both comforted and broken by the visions. The cabin was a tether to a time when she mattered not only as a teacher or wife, but as a woman alive in the full sense of the word. She both longed for it and dreaded it, knowing she would never walk those floors again. The townspeople regarded Elizabeth with a mixture of respect and distance. They knew her as the woman who had once taught their parents or themselves how to read poetry, the woman whose sharp tongue and warm heart had shaped countless children. But now she was mostly a figure glimpsed through the window, her silver hair gleaming like a crown in the sunlight. They greeted her politely, sometimes offered to bring her groceries, but life moved too fast for them to linger. Elizabeth was grateful for their kindness, yet she felt the invisible wall between her world and theirs. They were hurrying through lives she had already lived. Her health was failing in the way it does for those who have carried nearly a century on their shoulders. Some mornings she woke to pain so sharp she could barely rise. Other mornings her memory flickered, faces from the past merging with the present, until she blinked herself back to reality. Still, she held on to her independence stubbornly. She refused to move into assisted living, refused to surrender the keys to her home. To her, those concessions meant admitting that she was waiting for the end, and she preferred to live, however quietly, on her own terms. On long afternoons she would sit outside, wrapped in a knitted shawl, and watch the trees sway. The cabin haunted her thoughts more often then. She imagined it as a skeleton in the woods, sagging under the weight of years, but she could not bring herself to let it go. It was still legally hers, though no one else knew or cared. She had received offers once, decades ago, when developers wanted to clear the land, but she had refused. Selling it would feel like erasing James, erasing herself. So she kept the cabin like she kept her memories, locked away, fragile and fading, yet still alive in the hidden corners of her heart. That balance between holding on and letting go defined her days. She rose, she ate, she remembered, she endured. 92 years had stripped her of illusions, but not of the quiet dignity that made her who she was. She knew the end was near. She could feel it in the heaviness of her chest, in the way the world around her seemed sharper, as though every detail wanted to imprint itself before she left. What she did not yet know was that fate, indifferent to her plans, would soon place in her path a man whose life had unraveled, and that through him she would find an answer to the question that gnawed at her. What becomes of a legacy when there is no one left to inherit it? Elizabeth did not yet sense that the thread of her story and the thread of another, worn and frayed, were about to weave together. She only knew that she was tired, and that somewhere in the woods stood a cabin that was waiting for something she could not yet name. Elizabeth's world of quiet endurance and distant memories was not the only life unfolding in that little town. Beyond her tidy curtains and the warmth of her small living room, another existence ran parallel, harsh and unforgiving. It was a life stripped of comfort, where each day was a matter of survival, and each night stretched into a battle against cold and despair. This was the life of Marcus, a man who, unlike Elizabeth, was still in the middle years of life, but had been cast aside by circumstance until he became nearly invisible to those who passed him by on the streets. Marcus was born far from the town where he now drifted, in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of a larger city. His skin was dark, his build once strong from years of labor, and his voice had carried authority in the past when he called out instructions on job sites or reassured his young son that everything would be all right. He had grown up with the belief that if a man worked hard enough, if he put his back into honest labor, then the world would grant him a place. And for a time, that belief seemed true. He worked construction jobs straight out of high school, proving himself reliable, earning a reputation for being the man who could fix anything. He married young, a woman named Lorraine, whose laughter was so bright it turned heads. Together they had a boy, Samuel, whose small hands once wrapped around Marcus's thumb as though it were the only anchor he needed. But life had a way of undoing itself. Lorraine fell ill and passed far too soon, leaving Marcus with grief he didn't know how to carry. Samuel went to live with Lorraine's sister in another state, because Marcus, with his unpredictable hours and heavy jobs, could not provide the stability a child needed. Marcus told himself it was temporary, that once he saved enough, once he found steadier work, his son would come back. But years slipped by, and the boy grew up without him. The breaking point came when Marcus injured his back on a job. It was the kind of injury that didn't seem catastrophic at first, just a pulled muscle, he thought, something that would heal, but the pain lingered, flared, and never truly went away. He could no longer lift beams the way he once had, could no longer climb ladders with the same confidence. Employers stopped calling him, bills piled up, rent went unpaid, and the small apartment he had clung to slipped from his hands. He had no savings to fall back on. Like a row of dominoes, each piece of his life collapsed until he found himself standing outside in the cold, with no key in his pocket, no bed waiting for him. At first, he drifted between shelters, grateful for the cot, the lukewarm meals, and the chance to shower once in a while. But shelters closed, beds filled quickly, and when one burned down after a tragic fire, Marcus was left with nothing but the streets. He carried a duffel bag with a few shirts, a pair of worn boots, and a photograph of his son, already creased from being folded too often. That photograph was the last tangible proof that he had once been a father, a man with a family. Life on the street carved lines into his face that had nothing to do with age. His beard grew ragged. His clothes carried the damp smell of rain and smoke from nights huddled by dumpsters. He grew accustomed to hunger gnawing at him, to people looking past him as though he were air. The world treated him not as a man, but as an obstacle to be avoided. He noticed the way eyes slid away when he asked for change, the way mothers pulled their children closer when he shuffled near. The sting of rejection grew dull with repetition, but it never vanished completely. Yet, within him, something refused to die. Marcus had once built walls, roofs, porches, homes where families gathered. Even as he sat on sidewalks, he remembered the feel of wood under his hands, the satisfaction of hammer striking nail, the pride of standing back to admire a job well done. Those memories were like embers in the ash of his life, small but glowing. He still noticed broken hinges on doors as he passed, still thought about how a porch railing could be tightened or how a crooked beam might be straightened. It was the part of him that had not been stripped away, the craftsman's eye, the worker's pride, though no one else cared to see it anymore. His days became a routine of endurance. He woke stiff from concrete benches or alleyways, brushed dirt from his clothes, and searched for food. Sometimes he earned a meal by offering to sweep a shopkeeper's entrance or haul garbage bags to a bin. More often, he relied on what he could find in trash bins or what kind souls left behind. The nights were the hardest. The cold settled into his bones, and with it came the silence, the reminder that he was utterly alone. In those hours, he thought of Lorraine, of Samuel, of the man he used to be. The weight of loss pressed down, heavier than the hunger. Still, Marcus carried himself with a quiet dignity. He did not beg aggressively, did not shout or curse at those who ignored him. He lowered his gaze, spoke softly when spoken to, and carried his pain inward. It was not pride, but a stubborn belief that he remained a man, no matter how the world treated him. To let go of that belief would mean surrendering entirely. And even though he had fallen far, he was not yet ready to disappear. As winter gave way to spring, Marcus found himself lingering often near the edge of the small town where Elizabeth Harper lived. There was a gas station with a wide awning that offered shelter from rain, and benches where he could sit without being shooed away too quickly. The townspeople passed by him every day, some dropping a coin into his hand, most pretending he wasn't there. He did not hate them for it. He had once been like them, rushing through his life, barely noticing the shadows on the sidewalks. Now he was one of those shadows, and he accepted it with weary resignation. But beneath that resignation, a part of him still waited, still hoped for something undefined. He did not know what shape it might take, a job, a kind word, a place to sleep without fear. He only knew that the ember of his old self was not entirely gone, and that if the right wind came along, it might still flare into flame. It was in those restless, uncertain days, sitting beneath the awning and holding his duffel bag close against the chill, that the course of Marcus's life began to bend. He could not have imagined that a woman older than the century itself, frail and hunched but with eyes that saw more deeply than most, would notice him. He could not have imagined that her memories of a forgotten wooden cabin, decaying in the forest, would entwine with his hunger for purpose. And he could not have imagined that the quiet dignity he carried, invisible to the rushing world, would be the very thing that changed everything. For now, though, he knew only the weight of the present, the dampness of his clothes, the ache in his back, the indifference of strangers. The forest cabin was not yet part of his reality, but fate had already begun to thread the strands together, preparing to draw Elizabeth and Marcus toward one another, two broken lives on the edge of a chance neither expected. Marcus had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his days, even if they were stitched together by discomfort and longing. The gas station on the edge of town had become his shelter, its overhanging awning protecting him from the rain and sun alike. The bench where he often sat creaked under his weight, and sometimes he leaned against the brick wall, feeling its warmth when the sun struck it in the afternoons. He had learned to occupy himself with watching the flow of people, the hurried shuffle of a mother dragging her child toward the bus stop, the steady gait of men heading to their jobs with lunch boxes swinging from their hands, the swirl of teenagers laughing too loudly as they passed him by without acknowledgement. This was the stage where his quiet struggle played out, a backdrop to the world that neither knew nor cared about his existence. Yet the world, in its indifferent way, was preparing something for him, though he had no inkling of it. Elizabeth Harper, wrapped in her maroon sweater and supported by her curved cane, was walking that morning with a deliberateness born of age. At 92, every step was measured, each movement an act of endurance, but her mind was still quick. She had taken to leaving her house more often, sensing perhaps that time was shorter now and that she could no longer wait for the world to come to her. It was on one of these excursions that her eyes fell upon Marcus, slumped on the bench, his arms wrapped around himself against the chill of morning. She might have looked away, as others did, but something inside her refused. The line of his shoulders, the weariness etched into his face, stirred in her an ache she had not felt in years, the same ache she had once felt when James returned from long days of work, his body exhausted, yet his spirit unbroken. She saw not a beggar, but a man carrying the weight of a story. There was something familiar in the way he sat, as though he had once known belonging and dignity and had been forced to surrender them. Elizabeth, who had carried her own decades of sorrow and solitude, recognized the shape of loss in another. For a moment, she felt the old instinct of the teacher rise within her, the impulse to see beyond appearances, to notice what others ignored, to draw out the humanity in someone others dismissed. The first time their paths crossed, it was only with a glance, yet the glance lingered with her after she returned home. That night, she sat in her chair by the window, staring out at the street lights, and thought of the cabin she had abandoned long ago. She wondered what James would have said if he had seen the man at the gas station. She imagined him setting down his tools, walking over with that steady confidence of his, and asking the man about his work, his hands, his life. James had always believed in the value of a man's labor, in the worth that could be restored with trust and opportunity. Elizabeth's eyes blurred as she considered the possibility that perhaps she was being nudged toward something larger than herself. Marcus, for his part, noticed the woman only vaguely at first. He saw many people pass by, and though she moved slowly, she was one more stranger among dozens. Yet, when she came again, her presence lingered. There was something different about her gaze, about the fact that she did not recoil from him. She seemed fragile, almost breakable, and yet her eyes held no fear. He was struck by the contrast, a woman nearly a century old, leaning on a cane, and yet she looked at him with more steadiness than any other passer-by. He did not know what to make of it, but the thought of her stayed with him as he tried to sleep on the hard bench, wrapping his coat tighter against the night air. The days turned into a rhythm. She would walk toward the station in the mornings, sometimes carrying a small bag, and he would be there, sitting as always. Their presence became a pattern, the kind of quiet repetition that slowly builds familiarity without words. For Elizabeth, each step closer to him was a confrontation with her own fears, fear of strangers, fear of disappointment, fear of being foolish at her age. But she reminded herself that she had lived through worse. She had loved and lost, endured decades of silence, survived nights filled with memories too heavy to bear. What was there to fear in acknowledging another human being who seemed to her as lost as she felt? Her thoughts circled back to the cabin. For years she had kept it hidden in her mind, locked away with her grief. Yet now, watching Marcus, she began to imagine it differently. What if the cabin was not simply a relic of sorrow, but a vessel of possibility? She thought of its sagging roof, its dust-covered rooms, the photographs and belongings left inside like fossils of her life with James. The cabin was decaying, much like her body, but perhaps it did not have to vanish as quietly as she might. She felt a stirring, faint but insistent, that the cabin could be reborn if placed in the hands of someone who needed it more than she did. Still, she wrestled with doubt. Was she being foolish? Was it madness to even consider entrusting something so personal to a man she did not know? And yet, what did she have to lose? She had no heirs, no family left to quarrel over her belongings. The cabin, untouched for decades, was already on its way to ruin. Perhaps, she thought, ruin was not its destiny after all. Perhaps it was waiting, just as she had been waiting without knowing why, for the right moment and the right person. Marcus continued his days in the same weary fashion, but something about the old woman's presence unsettled the monotony. He found himself thinking about her, wondering why she looked at him the way she did, why she seemed to hesitate near him as though she had words she wanted to speak. He was not used to such attention. Most people dismissed him without acknowledgement, and the few who offered charity did so quickly, almost with guilt. But her eyes held something else, a quiet deliberation that made him uneasy and oddly hopeful at the same time. The town itself seemed to conspire in their meetings. The morning fog would lift just as Elizabeth approached the station, her cane tapping against the pavement in steady rhythm, and Marcus would already be seated, hunched against the chill. Birds perched on the wires above them, cars hummed past. Life went on as usual. Yet in the small pocket of space they shared, something unspoken grew. It was not yet trust, not yet purpose, but it was a seed planted by chance, waiting for soil. Elizabeth returned home from those mornings with a strange energy. She would sit in her kitchen, the sunlight angling through the lace curtains, and feel the stirrings of a decision pressing at her. The thought of the cabin rose again and again, insistent now, demanding attention. It was as though James himself whispered through the leaves of the forest, urging her not to let their creation die. The cabin had been built with love, with labor, with the intention of shelter and belonging. How could she allow it to rot into nothingness when there was still someone in need of it? Marcus, meanwhile, sat longer under the awning after she left, the plastic bag of food she sometimes gave him resting in his lap. He felt humbled by her gestures, though he never asked for them. They reminded him of the days when kindness had been natural, when Lorraine had packed his lunch and Samuel had hugged his leg before he left for work. He thought of the home he had lost, of the life stripped from him, and wondered why this woman, this stranger, bothered to see him. The fateful encounter was not a single moment, but a gradual unfolding, a series of small steps that led them toward one another. It was Elizabeth's recognition of the man beneath the ragged clothes, Marcus's recognition of the humanity that lingered in her gaze, and the silent call of a cabin hidden in the forest, waiting for life to be breathed into it again. Their stories, long separate, had begun to weave together, though neither fully understood it yet. For Elizabeth, the decision was forming like dawn breaking behind the clouds. For Marcus, the stirrings of hope were fragile but undeniable. The world had ignored them both in different ways, but fate was gathering them slowly into the same circle. And soon, one act of trust would change the course of their lives forever. The decision Elizabeth had wrestled with for so long had finally settled within her like a stone sinking gently into still water. It had not come with fanfare or dramatic clarity, only with the quiet resolve of a woman who had lived long enough to know when the time for hesitation was over. Marcus was the one. She could not have explained why to anyone else, but in her heart the certainty was firm. He had the hands of a worker, the eyes of a man who had seen too much, but had not yet surrendered, and the kind of dignity that could not be bought or taught. To her, it was enough. And so, one morning, she gave him what no one else could have expected, a chance. The cabin, untouched for decades, was his now, if he wanted it. The weight of her decision hung between them, but in Marcus it sparked something dormant. Though disbelief lingered, though he struggled to accept such a gift, his soul had already begun to turn toward the forest, toward the idea that perhaps his story was not yet finished. When Marcus set out to find the cabin, the day was cool, and the forest lay ahead like a dark mystery. The directions Elizabeth had given him were more memory than map, scribbled lines and landmarks that spoke of a time when she and James had walked those paths freely. He carried them in his pocket, along with the thin hope that perhaps the place still existed at all. The trail leading from the gravel road was overgrown, grasses and vines curling across what had once been a clear path. His boots crunched on fallen branches, his hands pushed aside brambles, and each step deeper into the woods felt like a step away from the life he had known, a life bound to streets and shadows. The forest was alive with sound. Birds called to one another from the canopy, insects hummed, leaves whispered in the wind. Marcus breathed it in, the sharp scent of pine and earth, the dampness that clung to the air. He had not walked through woods like these since his childhood, and the sensation stirred old memories, faint but comforting. The world here was different from the one he had endured on sidewalks and beneath neon lights. Here, time seemed slower, protective, as though the trees themselves had been guarding the cabin all these years. When at last he saw it, tucked between thick trunks and half swallowed by wild grass, he stopped in his tracks. The cabin crouched low, weary but still standing, like an old soldier left behind by time. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss, the porch tilted as though bowing to the ground, and shutters clung stubbornly to rusted hinges. Yet, despite its state, it was whole. It had survived storms, winters, the march of years, and though it bore the scars of neglect, it remained. For Marcus, who knew what it was to be battered and overlooked, the cabin's persistence struck something deep inside him. He approached cautiously, each step stirring dust from the porch boards. The wood groaned under his weight, but did not break. The front door leaned crookedly, and when he pressed against it, it gave way with a reluctant sigh, opening into shadows. The air inside was thick with dust, still and heavy, as though no breath had stirred it in decades. Shafts of light pierced through cracks in the walls, illuminating the outlines of furniture hidden beneath white sheets. Chairs, a table, a dresser, they stood like silent ghosts waiting for someone to lift the veil of abandonment. Marcus moved slowly, reverently, as if stepping into a sacred place. He pulled one of the sheets aside, coughing as dust rose into the light, and revealed a wooden rocking chair. Its curves were graceful, worn smooth by years of use, and though faded, it still carried the memory of comfort. Against the far wall, above the cold fireplace, hung a photograph. He wiped away the grime with his sleeve and found the smiling faces of Elizabeth and her husband, captured in black and white, standing proudly in front of the very cabin where Marcus now stood. The image sent a shiver through him. It was as though their presence lingered, watching him, measuring him. There was no electricity, no running water. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and cobwebs clung to the corners. Yet, what he felt was not despair. He did not see ruin, but possibility. His eyes, trained by years of work, noted what could be salvaged, what could be repaired. The roof needed patching, the porch needed bracing, the windows demanded new glass. These were problems, yes, but they were solvable. And as he looked around for the first time in years, Marcus felt not the suffocating weight of loss, but the fragile stirrings of hope. He lingered in each room, exploring. A small kitchen still held cupboards with rusted hinges. The bedroom bore a bed frame draped in dust and the faint scent of cedar. There was even a trunk at the foot of the bed, locked and silent, which he did not yet dare to open. Every corner of the cabin spoke of lives once lived, laughter once shared, silence once endured. Marcus touched the walls, the beams, feeling the solidness of the work, and imagined the hands that had built it. James's hands, steady and sure, shaping each piece with love. That night, he did not return to town. He spread his coat on the floor near the fireplace, laid his duffel bag beside him, and listened as the forest hummed outside. Through the cracks, he could see stars glinting, bright and distant, and he felt a peace he had not known in years. The cabin was broken, but it was shelter. It was not a sidewalk or a bench. It was a place that belonged to him now, a place where he could begin again if he dared. The thought filled him with both fear and determination. He knew the work ahead would be immense, perhaps even more than he could manage alone, but he had been given this chance, and something inside him whispered that it was meant to be. Morning light streamed in, revealing the cabin's flaws in sharper detail, but Marcus greeted them with resolve. He stepped outside, stretching his stiff back, and looked at the clearing around him. The grass was tall, wildflowers dotted the edges, and a path wound faintly toward the hills. Birds scattered at his movement, and the air was cool, fresh. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with something cleaner than he had tasted in years. This was not just a place to sleep. It was a place to rebuild, to create, to live. As he sat on the sagging porch, hammering at a loose board with a stone he had picked up, he heard footsteps. A man in his 60s emerged from the trees, carrying a bundle of firewood. He paused when he saw Marcus, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Marcus braced himself for the questions, for the dismissal he had grown used to, but instead the man gave a short nod. "So, you're the one," the man said after a pause, wiping his hands on his jeans. His voice was rough but not unkind. "Mrs. Harper mentioned someone might come. Thought this place was going to rot. Nice to see someone breathing life back into it." The words settled over Marcus with a weight he had not expected. He had not realized Elizabeth had spoken of him to others, had given him a place in her story. The neighbor's recognition affirmed that this was real, that he was not trespassing or dreaming. He belonged here now, in a way he had not belonged anywhere in years. That evening, when the neighbor had gone and the sky deepened to purple, Marcus sat on the porch again. The forest grew quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves, and stars unfolded above like a blanket. He leaned back, his body sore from the day's work, and let the stillness seep into him. Questions pressed at his mind. Why him? Why now? Why had Elizabeth chosen to trust him with something so precious? But even as doubt gnawed at him, a stronger feeling rose to the surface. For the first time in years, he had not only shelter, but purpose. The cabin was waiting, and he had been chosen to keep it alive. Marcus woke with the gray light of dawn spilling through the cracks in the cabin walls, a cool draft brushing across his face and carrying with it the scent of pine and damp soil. His back ached from the hard floor, but he felt a peculiar satisfaction as he sat up, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. For the first time in years, he had slept not on a public bench or beneath a gas station awning, but inside walls that belonged to him. Even in their broken, weathered state, those walls wrapped him in a kind of security he had long since stopped expecting from life. He rose slowly, stepping outside onto the porch, and saw the forest bathed in mist, shafts of sunlight piercing through the tall trees. The cabin looked every bit its age: sagging roof, warped boards, a porch barely holding together. But to Marcus, it was alive. It was waiting for his hands, and the challenge ahead filled him with a purpose that had lain dormant for too long. He began with what he knew best: clearing. Years of neglect had left the cabin surrounded by weeds and creeping vines that clung like skeletal fingers to the siding. Marcus pulled them away, tugging at roots, sweat soaking through his shirt even in the cool air. Each vine snapped free with a crack. Each clump of grass ripped from the soil revealed the outline of the cabin more clearly. The work was exhausting, his back protesting with each motion, yet he pressed on. He knew that before he could repair the cabin, he had to strip away the years of abandonment that smothered it. Inside, the dust was suffocating. He pried open the shutters to let in light and fresh air, wincing at the squeal of rusted hinges. Dust swirled in golden beams, dancing like spirits disturbed from slumber. He tore old sheets from furniture, coughed through the haze, and dragged broken pieces outside. The rocking chair, though fragile, he set gently back by the fireplace, treating it like a relic. The photograph of Elizabeth and James he placed carefully on the mantel, wiping the frame clean with a reverence that surprised even him. He felt as though they were watching him, silently approving or judging, and he resolved not to let them down. As days passed, his labor became a rhythm. He walked into town to scavenge what he could from junk dealers, returning with bent nails, worn hammers, cracked boards that still had strength left in them. He bartered small services where possible, offering to carry crates or sweep steps in exchange for tools. Sometimes he found cast-off planks by construction sites, the kind of wood others deemed useless. To Marcus, each piece was valuable, nothing was wasted, nothing too small. The first true battle was the roof. Rain would soon come, and he knew that if water seeped further into the beams, the cabin might not survive another season. He climbed carefully, the old boards groaning beneath his weight, and patched the holes with whatever he could gather: strips of metal, salvaged shingles, branches he cut and shaved to size. It was far from perfect, but as he hammered each piece into place, he felt a surge of pride. This was not charity. This was his own skill, his own labor bringing the cabin back to life. When he stood back and looked at the roof, uneven but secure, he felt something in himself tighten and strengthen, as if each nail he drove into wood was a nail securing him once more to the world. Neighbors began to notice the man who had appeared on Marcus's first night returned often, sometimes to watch, sometimes to lend a hand. His name was Jim, a man weathered by years and softened by the kind of rural patience that knew things took time. At first, Jim's curiosity was cautious. After all, a stranger suddenly working on a cabin abandoned for decades was cause for suspicion. But when he saw the sweat on Marcus's brow, the steady determination in his movements, his caution gave way to respect. Others followed. A farmer brought him nails from a shed he no longer used. A woman dropped off a bag of bread and apples. Slowly, the town that had once looked past Marcus began to see him anew, not as a shadow on a bench, but as a man resurrecting something they all thought lost. The work was grueling. Marcus's hands blistered, his muscles ached, and more than once he lay awake at night in the cabin, staring at the beams above him, wondering if he had taken on more than he could endure. But each morning, he rose again. He swept the floors until the boards gleamed faintly under the dust. He braced the porch with a salvaged post, steadying it so he could sit without fear of collapse. He repaired window frames, fitted them with panes of glass he salvaged from discarded frames, and watched with pride as light poured into the rooms, brightening spaces that had once felt like tombs. The fireplace, once clogged with ash and cobwebs, he cleared with careful patience, brick by brick, until it could breathe again. On the evening he built his first fire there, warmth spilling through the cabin and sparks crackling up into the night sky, Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. It had been years since he had sat in front of a fire, years since he had felt warmth not stolen from a vent or fleeting from a blanket of newspapers. The fire roared, alive, as though the cabin itself had drawn breath. He sat before it, hands outstretched, and whispered his thanks into the stillness. Through the weeks, Marcus discovered that repairing the cabin was repairing himself. Each board he nailed down seemed to straighten his own bent posture. Each window he cleaned seemed to clear a little of the fog from his soul. The work gave him back what the streets had taken: pride, dignity, and the knowledge that he could still build, still shape, still matter. The cabin mirrored his journey. It had been forgotten, weathered, nearly destroyed, but it was not beyond saving. Neither was he. Sometimes, when fatigue weighed heavily on him, he would glance at the photograph of Elizabeth and James and imagine what they would think. He pictured James's steady hands working alongside his own, offering guidance. He pictured Elizabeth, young and smiling, bringing them water and bread, her presence filling the cabin with laughter. These visions pushed him forward when his back screamed for rest, when his body trembled with exhaustion. He was not alone in this work. The cabin carried their spirits, and they carried him. By late summer, the transformation was visible. The roof held firm against sudden rains. The porch stood straight, its boards smooth and solid underfoot. The windows gleamed, catching the light of dawn and dusk. Inside, the rooms were clean, the air fresher, the fireplace glowing with life. Though much remained unfinished, the cabin had shifted from ruin to refuge. It was no longer a hollow memory of a life once lived. It was a living home again. Marcus sat one evening on the newly braced porch, sweat drying on his brow, the sky awash with the colors of sunset. Birds sang their final songs of the day, and the forest grew quiet. He felt a peace so deep it startled him. For the first time in years, he did not feel adrift. He had roots now, roots tied not just to the cabin, but to the promise he had made silently to Elizabeth. He would not let her gift wither. He would not let this chance be squandered. The resurrection of the cabin was the resurrection of Marcus. He had been a man invisible, discarded, surviving without hope. Now he was a man with walls around him, a roof over him, and work before him. He was becoming whole again, piece by piece, board by board, and though he did not yet know it, the cabin's revival was not only for him. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would stretch far beyond his own redemption, binding his story to others who, like him, had been forgotten. The weeks of steady labor had reshaped both the cabin and the man who worked upon it. Marcus had poured his strength into every wall and beam, his sweat into every nail and stone. In the glow of the fire that now burned in the once dead hearth, he felt the stirrings of a life he had thought forever lost. Yet, just as the cabin was becoming whole, fate reminded him that time for others was slipping away. One morning, as he walked into town with a bundle of wildflowers gathered from the hills to bring to Elizabeth, he found her place at Willow Heights hushed and solemn. A nurse with kind eyes met him in the hallway and told him gently that Elizabeth had passed in her sleep 2 nights before. The words struck him like a blow, so simple yet so final, and for a long moment Marcus could not breathe. The flowers trembled in his hand as though they too had wilted under the weight of loss. He had known, of course, that she was nearing the end. 92 years had worn her body thin, her steps frail, her voice soft with age. But knowing did nothing to dull the ache of losing the one person who had looked at him not as a shadow, but as a man. The nurse handed him a sealed envelope, his name written across it in the fragile handwriting he recognized at once. He walked outside and sat on a bench, staring at it until his hands steadied enough to tear it open. The words within carried her voice as though she were still beside him, urging him onward. She thanked him for making her feel alive again in her final days, spoke of the cabin not as a relic but as a gift meant to be nurtured, and hinted at secrets she had never shared, urging him to look behind the old bookshelf. She signed it simply, with love, Margaret Elizabeth Harper. Marcus held the letter to his chest, his vision blurred with tears he did not try to fight. He had lost her presence in the world, but she had left him a charge, one that reached beyond bricks and boards. He was no longer simply the man she had given a home to. He was now the bearer of her trust, the guardian of her legacy. The weight of it both burdened and lifted him, giving him something larger than himself to hold on to. When he returned to the cabin that evening, the forest welcomed him with its steady hush, the trees swaying as though bowing to the wind. Inside, he lit the fire and sat in the rocking chair, the letter resting in his lap. The flames flickered across the photograph of Elizabeth and James, and he thought of her watching him even now. He rose then, moving to the bookshelf she had mentioned, and after prying it away, he uncovered the hidden compartment, the box wedged between the studs. The latch was stubborn, rusted shut, but he forced it open, and inside he found the envelopes of cash, the silver coins, the bonds, the letters James had written. His breath caught as he realized the enormity of what they had left behind. $40,000 or more, in cash and valuables entrusted to him. It was not only a fortune but a trust, a belief that he would not squander it on himself but would use it as James had written, to help someone with a heart, someone who would do good. That night, Marcus lay awake long after the fire had died, the box open beside him. He did not think of himself first. He thought of the men he had known on the streets, men with haunted eyes and trembling hands, men who had once been strong, who had once worked, who had once been fathers and brothers and husbands before the world cast them aside. He thought of the shelters that had closed, the benches filled with silent bodies in the night, the hunger that gnawed without mercy. He thought of how one old woman's kindness had given him not only a roof, but a new life. If her gift could lift him from the ashes, could it not also lift others? In the days that followed, Marcus began to act. He used part of the money to strengthen the cabin further, installing plumbing, repairing the roof with the proper shingles, purchasing solar panels to give the house light at night. He bought a used pickup truck to haul supplies and to fetch men from town who needed work. He did not waste the money on comforts for himself, but on tools, lumber, and the means to expand the cabin's reach. Soon, the place was no longer a solitary refuge, but a home that could welcome others. The first man he brought back was a veteran named Carl, whose eyes darted at every sudden sound, whose nights were tormented by memories of war. Marcus gave him a cot in the corner, a warm meal, and a hammer. Together they repaired a broken fence, the rhythm of work soothing the restlessness in Carl's hands. Then came Jerome, a man who had once driven trucks across the country but had lost everything to drink. He, too, found in the cabin a chance to rebuild, to sweat for something that mattered. One by one, they came. Men without homes, without hope, each carrying scars the world could not see. Marcus gave them what Elizabeth had given him: shelter, dignity, and a chance to matter again. The cabin grew louder, filled with voices and laughter, the scrape of tools, the clatter of plates at mealtime. It was no longer a place of dust and silence, but of labor and fellowship. The men worked side by side, mending walls, chopping wood, planting a small garden in the clearing. They shared stories in the evenings by the fire, stories of battles fought, of families lost, of dreams abandoned and perhaps found again. Marcus listened, guiding them gently, not as a leader who sought control, but as one who had walked the same path of despair and had found a way through. He never claimed ownership. He told them simply that the cabin was a gift, passed on through kindness, and that their task was to honor it by living, working, and helping one another. Word spread slowly, whispered at first through the town and then further. A small article appeared in the local paper about the man who had turned an abandoned cabin into a refuge for the forgotten. Veterans groups began to take notice, sending supplies, sometimes even sending men who had nowhere else to go. Marcus never sought attention, never asked for praise. When questioned, he always gave the same answer. A 92-year-old woman gave me a house when I had nothing. She saw something in me when no one else did. This place is her gift, not mine. I am only passing it on. As autumn settled over the forest, the cabin stood strong against the winds, its porch solid, its windows glowing with light. Inside, the photograph of Elizabeth and James still hung above the fireplace, and beside it, Marcus placed the wedding bands he had found in the velvet pouch, displayed in a small shadow box with a plaque that read, "Love doesn't fade, it grows roots." Each evening, when the men gathered by the fire, Marcus felt her presence among them, her spirit woven into the laughter, the labor, the very walls. She had not only given him a home, she had given him a purpose that stretched far beyond his own salvation. Marcus sat sometimes on the porch in the quiet hours, the rocking chair beside him unmoved, and listened to the wind shifting through the trees. He imagined her there, perhaps smiling, perhaps nodding, as though approving of what her gift had become. The forest that once sheltered a forgotten ruin now embraced a living sanctuary. The cabin was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of what kindness could build, of what one act of trust could become when nurtured. And Marcus, who had once been invisible, was now the anchor, not only for himself, but for others who had lost their way. In the stillness of those evenings, he thought often of James's letter, the one left in the box, with its plea that the treasure be given to someone with a heart who would do good. Marcus had fulfilled that plea, and more. He understood now that the cabin was never meant to be a monument to the past, but a seed for the future. He had not only resurrected its walls, he had given it a soul that would endure long after him, and in that understanding, Marcus felt at peace, knowing that he had finally found not only a home, but a calling. By the time winter gave way to another spring, the cabin in the woods no longer resembled the fragile ruin Marcus had first discovered. The sagging roof had been reinforced and gleamed with new shingles that caught the light of the morning sun. The porch, once a hazard ready to collapse, stood straight and welcoming, its cedar planks smooth underfoot. Windows shone with glass that reflected the trees around them, and inside the air was warm, filled with the mingled scents of wood smoke, stew simmering on the stove, and the faint pine resin that seeped from the logs. The laughter of men, once broken and discarded by the world, echoed through the rooms. The cabin lived again, and in its rebirth it carried something larger than walls and beams. It carried the legacy of the woman who had entrusted it to a man everyone else had overlooked. Marcus had not sought recognition, yet the story of the cabin spread beyond the forest, carried by the voices of those whose lives it touched. Local townsfolk, once wary of the stranger who had appeared from nowhere, now spoke of him with respect. They brought food, tools, and clothes. A veterans group, moved by the tale of men finding dignity again through work and fellowship, began to send supplies and even helped connect Marcus to others who needed a place of refuge. The cabin became known quietly as Margaret's Porch, a name chosen by Marcus and the men who now called it home, to honor the woman whose kindness had set everything into motion. Inside, above the mantel where the fire burned bright each evening, hung the photograph of Elizabeth and James. Beside it, in the shadow box Marcus had built with his own hands, rested the 2 wedding bands he had found, accompanied by a simple plaque. Love doesn't fade. It grows roots. Every man who entered the cabin paused there at least once, some bowing their heads in respect, others staring silently, as though they could feel the presence of the woman who had given so much without asking anything in return. To Marcus, it was not decoration, but a reminder, a compass that kept the purpose of the cabin clear. Life at the cabin had settled into rhythm. The men who came were not expected to simply take shelter. Marcus insisted gently but firmly that they contribute, each according to his strength. Some chopped wood, others cooked meals, others repaired tools or planted vegetables in the small garden that now thrived near the clearing. Work was not punishment, but healing, and each nail driven, each row of soil turned, became a step away from despair and toward belonging. At night, they gathered around the fire, telling stories that spilled out slowly, sometimes haltingly, stories of families lost, of battles survived, of mistakes made and forgiven. The firelight flickered on their faces, softening their hard lines, and Marcus often sat listening more than speaking, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He never forgot the woman who had made it possible. In his mind, Elizabeth was always present, as though her spirit lingered in the walls. On still nights, when the trees whispered outside and the fire crackled within, Marcus would sit on the porch beside the old rocking chair and imagine her seated there, wrapped in her maroon sweater, her cane resting by her side. He spoke to her sometimes in the silence, thanking her, promising her that her gift was being honored. He felt her approval in the rustle of the leaves, in the warmth that seemed to embrace the cabin no matter how cold the wind blew. For the men who stayed, the cabin became more than a roof. It was proof that the world still held kindness, that one act of trust could ripple outward until it changed many lives. Carl, the veteran haunted by nightmares, now smiled as he worked in the garden, his hands steady, his eyes clearer. Jerome, once lost to drink, built furniture in the workshop Marcus had fashioned from an old shed, his skill returning with each carved line. Others came and went, some staying only long enough to regain their footing before moving on, others choosing to remain and become part of the growing community. Each left behind something of themselves: a carved chair, a planted tree, a repaired fence. And so the cabin grew richer, not just in structure but in soul. Marcus himself changed, though he did not notice it at first. The hunched figure who had once sat invisible on a bench at the gas station was gone. His shoulders had straightened with work, his hands had grown calloused again, not from hardship, but from creation. He carried himself with quiet authority, not as a man who commanded, but as one who guided, who steadied others with the simple fact of his presence. When asked why he had done it, why he continued to open the cabin to strangers, his answer was always the same. A 92-year-old woman gave me a house when I had nothing. She saw something in me. The only way to honor her is to pass it on. The seasons turned, and the cabin weathered them all. Snow blanketed its roof in winter, but the fire within kept its occupants warm. Spring brought blossoms to the clearing, and the garden flourished under the care of rough hands learning gentleness again. Summer evenings filled the porch with laughter, the men leaning back in chairs they had built, sipping cool water from the well Marcus had restored. Autumn painted the forest in gold and crimson, leaves scattering across the roof, reminding them that time moved forward, but roots remained. Through it all, the photograph above the fireplace and the rocking chair on the porch bore witness, silent anchors of the legacy that bound them. Marcus often thought of Samuel, his son. Though years of silence lay between them, he wrote letters he never sent, letters in which he spoke of the cabin, of the men it sheltered, of the woman who had believed in him when no one else had. He imagined one day bringing Samuel here, showing him what had been built, what kindness had created. Perhaps then his son would see him not as the man who had failed, but as the man who had risen again, not alone, but carried by the gift of another. That hope stayed with him, a quiet ember he nurtured alongside the fire in the hearth. As more people came to know the cabin, Marcus resisted those who urged him to expand, to seek funding, to build more houses. He understood their eagerness, but he also understood that the power of the cabin lay not in numbers, but in meaning. It was not meant to be an institution or an organization. It was a home, one born of love and sacrifice, and its strength lay in its intimacy. To grow too large would be to lose the very essence that Elizabeth had entrusted to him. He held firm, keeping the cabin as it was, a sanctuary, humble and strong, its doors open to those who needed it most. And so the years unfolded, each day another thread in the tapestry of the cabin story. Marcus aged, his hair graying, his face lined, but his spirit remained unbowed. Each evening he sat on the porch, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by others, the rocking chair always beside him. In the hush of twilight, when the forest grew still and the first stars appeared, he felt the presence of Elizabeth most strongly. He imagined her smile, the quiet nod of approval, the satisfaction of knowing that her gift had not been wasted, but had blossomed into something far greater than she could have dreamed. The cabin stood as her monument, not in stone or marble, but in wood and laughter, in sweat and tears, in the lives it had touched. It bore her name, not carved into walls, but carried in the hearts of those who found shelter within. Love doesn't fade, it grows roots. The plaque said it simply, but the truth of it lived in every corner, in every nail, in every life renewed. One act of kindness, given by a frail woman to a man who had nothing, had changed the course of countless lives. That was her legacy, carried forward by Marcus and the men who followed him, rooted deep in the soil of the forest, rising in the sturdy beams of the cabin, shining in the fire that burned each night. It was a legacy not of wealth or power, but of compassion, the kind that endures beyond death, the kind that grows roots and refuses to die. And so, as Marcus sat once more on the porch, the evening light softening around him, he closed his eyes and whispered a quiet thank you. The rocking chair creaked as though moved by an unseen hand, and in that moment he felt not alone, but accompanied, forever bound to the woman who had given him more than a home. She had given him back his life, and through him she had given life to many more. That was the true measure of her gift, and it would not be forgotten. If this story moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the next incredible story that will leave you speechless. Want more? Watch our other videos. Each one is packed with twists and moments you'll never forget. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can experience it too.